Hey guys, hope you're all well, and I'm super sorry it took so long to make another video. I've been really looking forward to making one, and today we're gonna go over how to make a Ruby API. It's gonna be pretty fun. We're basically just gonna write the backend logic, send the data to an endpoint, and front-end devs would actually fetch that data to display it on the front end, right? This is how you usually work in companies, and yeah. So let's go ahead, and we are going to generate a Rails new app. In that case, I'm going to call it book API because this is the example I'm going to use today. We're just going to create some books and try to display them on the endpoint. Now, just before you generate the app, Ruby gives you this ability to specify as one of the options that you want it as an API, so it goes much faster and it doesn't generate a lot of stuff that you actually don't need for that. So that's super cool. It makes your whole app lighter, and that's exactly what we want. Let's cd into our folder and open it up. And first you can notice that there's a lot of stuff that is not there, including some of stuff in the view, a lot of JavaScript that is not there. It's perfect. We don't need it for the backend. So let's generate our books model. So Rails also gives us this command that you probably know, which is generating a resource directly. We want to give it a title as a string, description as a text, and maybe rating. Oops. Yeah, I'll be doing a lot of typos, by the way, guys, because this is the work computer and I'm not used to the keyboard. So yeah, Rails generate resources basically just generates the model, the controller, and the routes for you. It doesn't generate any of the actions, but we don't need that. So you can see that now we have our books controller, we have our book model, and if we go to routes, we can see that we have our resource books. Awesome. So what you want to do usually by convention when creating an API is namespacing that. So you want to namespace it by API defaults, give it a default for the format, right? So we want the format to be JSON. So this is basically telling Rails that it should expect, we are going to tell it that it should expect this resource inside of this namespace. So it would be API/v1/books. So let's add the v1 namespace as well. v1 namespace as well, sorry. Awesome. So you can see here that basically we don't need to scope our books inside of v1 because basically we just want all of the actions to appear under that scope. So this is what we needed. So we can go ahead actually and jump to our controller and start coding our index and see what we would actually get. Now, just before I forget, guys, I'm going to be using an app called Postman. Postman is going to allow you to simulate the responses that you get on the URLs. So it allows you to play with the data, put on parameters, headers, and see what kind of response you would actually get. You can even simulate post or delete requests, even put requests, and just by sending in some data inside of a body, it allows you to play around. It's much easier. It makes your life much easier. So this is what I'm going to be using. You can, guys, like, just go ahead and download it. It won't take long and it's free. So we want the index to basically hold all of our books for now. We are not going to add any logic, but everything works the same as if you were on a normal Rails app, basically. So you just say, you create a variable, assign it all of the books, and let's say we want to render all of those books. You would just render it as a JSON, and you pass in the variable that you want to appear there. didn't save this file. You know what I'm going to do actually? I'm going to take this defaults here and I'm just going to add it on the resource. It's cleaner. Nice. So now we would expect the response whenever we go to API/v1/books, we would expect to get back all of those books, which we don't have any actually yet. So let's migrate. Let's open up the console and let's start the server. Awesome, server's up. Let's create our first book. Title of first book. Description. First book. Description. I'm not very creative today, am I? On a rating of 4. Awesome. So now we have one book. So we would expect that whenever we go to this URL to get back the data, right? Now we will get an error and it's saying initialized constant API. And of course we namespace inside of our routes by API v1. So Rails is expecting to find this books controller inside of API v1, which is not the case. It's just inside of controllers. So we need to change that, create a folder called API. Inside of the folder called API, we will create another folder called v1, and we can move that books controller in it. So let's do that from the terminal. No. We are going to move it inside of API v1. Perfect. So again, we will also have to change that here. So as it is separated inside of folders, Rails is expecting different modules. So the first one would be API, second one again would be v1, and then we would actually pass in the class. So that can stay like that. Perfect. Awesome. So let's try that out now. Capital V. Thank you, Ruby. So let's try and see what it gets us. So we actually get that first book back. So that's great. There is something we want to do though, is or actually I'll include that in another tutorial. Let's not make it too long because we still have a lot to cover. So that's awesome. We're getting the books back. We're getting an array with all the books because this is what we're sending in. Perfect. So now let's assume we wanted to exclude some of the data, right? We don't want to send in everything. For example, if there was a password in that data, we wouldn't want to send it. So we could say accept and pass in an array of what we want, or if it's just one. So if I don't want to pass in the title, we could just say accept title and we would get everything except the title. So keep that in mind. For now, we do not need it. Great. So we can always, of course, describe the show. So everything works the same, really. We would pass in an ID inside of the params. So us on the back end would just basically grab that ID and find a book with that param. Let me find this. Perfect. And we would just render it. So let's simulate another request, and basically we would just copy and paste that and pass in an ID. In that case, we only have one book, so we pass the ID of 1, and we get an error. So it seems like I forgot to put the end to my show action. Let's try that again, and perfect. Now we get the book back. If we would pass ID 2 here, it would not work, of course. You would need to write how to handle errors yourself, but you can just see that you couldn't find ID with 2. So if we would basically just go back to the console here and create another book without any value, but we would still get it back. Just that the title would be null. Awesome. Now I'm sorry, I'm speeding through this because it's basically the same thing. It's just grabbing data and rendering it on the response. What I want to show you, which is a little bit different, is what happens when you actually want to simulate like post requests and put requests. So something that you would want to do is inside of your application controller, you would basically want to turn the response that you get and parse it into a JSON, right? So we write a method for that. We call it JSON payload. And what I like to do is we just call one of Ruby's classes called hash with indifferent access. We initialize it, and inside of it we are going to basically parse. So the argument we give it, is the parsed response, right? So to get the response, you just request the raw post. And why am I doing that? Basically, this class here is going to differentiate symbols and strings, if you can say so. Title with quotes would be the same as title and a column. And basically, whenever we want to send in the data through the body, we are going to call the JSON payload, right? This is how we are getting the raw post, which is the body of the response. It doesn't probably make sense right now, but let me go through one of the post or put requests and we will see. So let's assume we want to create through Postman. So through the endpoint, we want to be able to create stuff. So we want to be able to send the data somewhere, right? So the front end, what the front end would do is they would have a form and they would send the data through the form, through the body of the response, the HTTP request, sorry. So we would basically grab this body, and this body is grabbed with the method we just described. So JSON payload, it would request the raw body, the raw post, it would parse it into a JSON, and it would initialize it with the hash with indifferent access, which is not necessary, it just makes your life better. So now basically we have that response, we have that body inside of here, and we're assigning it to a variable called data. It's just easier to understand. And then when we would want to create a new book, for example, so we would say book.new, like you always did with Rails. You always create a new one. And basically, usually what you would do here is that you would like pass in the strong params, right, that you write in the controller down, and like the ones that you permitted. But in that case, you just pass in the body. So now, what would happen if actually someone would send, like a malicious user would send us like wrong data or like a lot of data or try to make himself become an admin? Well, that would be bad, and that is not something we want. So one way to avoid that is, for example, we can initialize, for example, a constant here called allowed data, and this constant would basically take whatever we want to allow the user to send us. So body, for example, and we are going to freeze that so that it does not change. So this is what we want. Actually, we call it description, not body, and there's rating as well. So these are the things that are allowed. If someone tries to send something else, these are not what we consider as allowed data. I hate this keyword. Awesome. So now we have our allowed data, but what do we do with it, right? So we want to go through the JSON payload, and we are going to iterate through whatever was passed in through that payload. And we are going to say if if the allowed data includes any of the attributes from the JSON payload, then yes, we want to select it and put it in data. Otherwise, the other ones is just going to ignore it. You could also use reject and do it other way around. but this is fine for now. So we're just selecting the proper ones, assigning them to data. So if here the user would send something else such as admin true, this method here would ignore it. This iteration would ignore it and just select the title, description, and rating. Store it in a variable called data. Then we would create a new book with this data. And then the usual, if the book is saved, we want to render JSON with that book. Otherwise, we can render an error message. Could not created. Cool. So let's try this out. So same thing, we are going to simulate the request here. We go to books, but this time it's going to be post. And what we are going to do is pass in some body information. So the title, and I want this title to be my test book. I can pass in description. Look at this, and finally the rating. So let's try sending this, and we get an internal error. And again, I forgot to put an end. Oh my god. Let's try that. So undefined method include. I forgot the question mark. Sorry, because what we want is actually to return true if it does include it, and if it does return true, then we store it inside of the variable. I'm sorry guys, you probably realized that, but awesome. So we get the response back. We're not getting an error message. So you can see here test book. Perfect. So we got the book. We can even like make sure, or actually just by using our API, and make sure that we get all the books back. And you can see that our book now appears here. Now what would happen if inside of the body of this HTTP request we would actually send something else? So if I would want to turn myself into an admin user so that I can do bad stuff, right? So obviously like nothing happens. So that was probably a bad example because we don't even have the admin attribute. But what if rating is not allowed and we still try to pass in the rating here? What would happen? You can see that rating is ignored and is actually turned into null. So this is how you avoid mass assignment. This malicious use of data is called mass assignment, and we want to avoid that. So now basically we just made the post request, we made the get request. We can also do a put request or a delete request. So the put is very similar to the create. So let's go directly to the delete. And again, very similar to the show. So we know that the front end is going to send us the params. So why am I writing notes? Book dot find. So we find a book based on the param we get through the URL. Alright, and we just destroy that book. Alright. So let's use this URL, change this into a delete. And let's say I want to delete the book number 2. Alright. Oh my god, you guys must be laughing at me. Oh. Alright, so we don't get anything because we're not actually rendering any data there. But if you would refresh this page, you can see that the book number 2 is gone because we destroyed it. Awesome. So guys, that was it. That's the very basic of how to create it. You can grab data, you write all of the logic, right? You store it inside of a variable and you just render it on the endpoint. So very basic stuff. Everything works the same for us as backend. The probably the biggest challenge of it is that everything is more abstract. You don't see the front end. You have to assume, you have to align with the front end devs. Hey guys, this is what you need to send through this endpoint, etc. Now maybe later on, I don't know if you guys appreciated that video, but later on what I could do is actually go over something called Blueprinter. So it's a gem, and it just makes it easier to send JSON data to an endpoint. So I could cover that, and I could also cover how does the front end then deal with that data that we just sent here. So thank you so much for watching. Subscribe and leave a like. Cheers.